For our first bite-sized portion of analyzing, how we're going to bring this all together, please go to your course content folder and open up our Momentum Trading Dashboard Notebook. Inside of this, we're actually going to focus on a few key specific things for this first section, and really in particular what we added to interact with our broker and our Alpaca Functions notebook, which is going to contain all the functions we need to interact and call this information. So with that, let's first touch on the items that we're adding to the layout itself. So we added in a few new buttons, we added in a new drop down, some configurable items here that you see, and then we added in a couple new tables to refer to our orders and our positions. So first, let's start with the functions. So these should feel very familiar. Back in our section where we covered interacting with our brokerage, we created these market order, limit order, bracket order functions. We referenced how we get our account and our portfolio history. We referenced getting our orders and our positions. We did add a couple new ones to this where we are going to be able to go and cancel an order and close positions. So this is one that we haven't covered previously, but we're very simply going to utilize a couple additional functions that allow us to interact and say if we have an open order, if we have positions we want to close, being able to pass it an ID and calling their cancel order and close position functions to be able to interact with those. So this is one that I would recommend you having if you even want to go with Robinhood or TD Ameritrade. Creating these types of functions where you can reference them through multiple strategies has been a good idea in my instances, instead of trying to throw these all into one notebook, putting this in here and then keeping this up to date as those APIs change. As you define different inputs that you want to change here, so you can even see from our example we did add side into this where we want to make this flexible if we want to be able to short sell. So just keep in mind these are the same things. If you want to go back to that section and refresh yourself on any of these, feel free, but for the most part each of these have been defined, and we're just sticking them into this large notebook so that we don't have to build this all into our momentum trading notebook, and we can keep all of our Alpaca functions in one area and be able to reference that. So we do import that into our dashboard utilizing this call, and we're going to use the asterisk letting it know that we want to be able to call any function from Alpaca Functions notebook that we so choose. And for those, if you missed it in some of the previous sections, remember that Alpaca Function notebook has to remain inside of this course content folder where you're running the momentum trading dashboard, so that it can see it and it can actually get those. Alright, so with that, we did also add additional items to this update here. So we added in more buttons, more options for configurability, and more tables. So please go ahead and jump down to your your momentum trading dashboard and go to where we start creating the layout. So underneath of the dash layout, you can see at the top we're utilizing a few additional dash bootstrap items. So this helps me visually, and just the way my brain works and aligns sometimes when I'm creating these layouts. It helps me see how we're putting these onto the board. So I took advantage of the bootstrap row and column items that allow me to define each of the items I want in a row and the various columns that are in there, so equally spacing out the columns or the objects that I'm adding to it. So it takes care of the spacing while allowing me to define that all these things should be on a unique row and not sitting one after another. So within this row you're going to define each of those columns, and then you're going to define what goes into them. So we added a new button for auto trading, which I'm not going to cover right now. We will cover that in a little bit. A new button for submitting orders, an input group that has a text field and a drop down which will allow us to define the type that we want to enter, an input group which has a text field defining that it's a quantity, and then an input type which is a number, which is slightly different than what we've done in the past where it's all been text. So we can add up to hundredths of a quantity inside of this field. And we also have added 2 additional fields for adding in our limit and stop price values, which will be handy when we're submitting limit and bracket order types. Going down a little lower here, so below our comparison table, which we put into our base application, we're going to define these additional items. So we're going to define a new row which contains a header for alpaca orders and a new button which will allow us to cancel orders. So we can see the header and our button to cancel orders. Below that, we have a table which allows us to put in our orders that we are grabbing from our alpaca function, where we get our orders and our positions. And I'll show you where we call that here in our next video. But we are adding this table. It's going to feel very similar to the other tables we've added. We're just populating it with our alpaca orders. Below that, we are also adding our DBC row to have an alpaca positions header and a close selected position button. So here and here. And then directly below that, we're adding again another table that has our alpaca portfolio information. So our portfolio table is going to be populating our data and our columns for this unique field. Lastly, before we jump into the next section where we're going to talk about that interactability and what's happening with those buttons, we have also added a few additional pieces to this to be able to reference callbacks and update at different intervals. So down here you're going to notice before I was only utilizing one toast, and I was only utilizing one toast because we only had one callback. It's important to note that you can only update the outputs in one unique callback. So if I have multiple callbacks that we're going to utilize like we do in this notebook, so a callback to update tables and graphics, a callback to update trading options, callback to update tables, and I think there's one additional for our auto trader. If I have multiple callbacks, I can only define one output per callback. So I cannot update the limit price disabled property in multiple callbacks. It can only be done in one. So with that, I have created multiple toasts so that I can use a toast to understand that each of my callbacks have been fired. So each of these 4 toasts you see here are going to be used to tell me that one of these callbacks has worked and that something has been fired. So those are new to this, is these multiple toasts. And then also we have added in 2 new interval components. So there are certain things to remember when you're calling APIs, even from Alpaca or Y Finance. When you call them, you can only call them so many times before they will block you for overuse. So for Y Finance, I think you can only call so many securities and call their API so many times within a minute, within a day. So we define those as calling only either every 30, 60, or 10 seconds. For Y Finance, I'm only getting minute data, so it really doesn't make sense that I pull it faster than a minute anyways to do the analysis. So it's fine if that updates every 60 seconds. But something like my Alpaca table, I've got a limited amount of calls if I'm not paying for their premium experience, but I might want to understand a little faster how my portfolio is doing, or how, if I placed a trade, if it went through and I want to update my orders and I want to figure out, certain additional pieces. So it's important that you understand you can update different parts of your graphic at different times. You do not have to have them all on the same interval component. So we are going to introduce several interval components which will help us fire our callbacks at different times. So not everything has to be at 30 seconds or 60 or 10, and we'll go through that as we look at some of these callbacks here in the next section. Lastly, before we jump into what we're actually doing with these interactive buttons, please also go through and look at the callbacks. So before, we only had one. We were doing it all at one point. We had a certain set of defined inputs. Here we're adding a little bit more complexity, where we're not updating everything through the same callback. We're only doing certain things with them. We're only doing the interval components, calling one interval component within one, and then calling a second one, or not calling one at all in some of the others. So here you've got interval component 2 firing this one, 3 firing this one, 1 was firing the first one. So please go through and get yourself immersed in the new items we added, those various interval components, and then how we're updating the callbacks based upon these new configurations. So look at the outputs, look at the inputs, look at the states, try to track through what values we're grabbing, what we're using to activate the callbacks, and then before we jump into the next section, be very familiar with it. So I'm not going to jump, I'm not going to try to jump into all of that detail on here because I think we've covered it, and I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing me drab on about the order of the inputs, output states, and making sure your returns are right and the values are, and the types you're pushing back are right. Just try to go through here, figure out what we're doing with each callback, and once you're ready, proceed to the next section where we will actually start to show how we're interacting with these buttons and what the callbacks are doing when we press submit order and choose a selection in that table. Okay, so with that, again, once you're comfortable, feel free to jump forward and we will start to analyze a little deeper the callbacks to interact with our brokerage.